On April 9th, 2018, podcaster Sam Harris and podcaster Ezra Klein did a joint podcast where they debated the scientific merit of the race realism work of a man named Charles Murray. Ezra Klein is a political journalist. He's the editor-in-chief at the website Vox.com. Sam Harris is a neuroscientist and an author, and he is part of the New Atheist philosophical movement. He is primarily concerned with questions of science and atheism and morality, whereas Klein is primarily concerned with questions of policy. So what kicked off this dramatic year-long feud between the two, and what inspired this debate? In April 2017, Harris had Charles Murray on his podcast, and the two of them talked about Murray's work in the field of race realism, which Murray wrote about in his book, The Bell Curve. In The Bell Curve, Murray argues that whites have a higher IQ on average than blacks, and that this IQ difference is partly determined by genetic factors and is partly determined by environmental factors, but is basically immutable, meaning it cannot be changed. Harris tantalizingly called this episode with Murray forbidden knowledge. Shortly afterwards, Vox.com published an article written by professors of psychology, 3 professors, titled "Charles Murray is once again peddling junk science about race and IQ," with the subtitle, "Podcaster and author Sam Harris is the latest to fall for it." That article argued that Murray's science is faulty, and that Murray's science does not represent the scientific consensus on this issue. Harris was very offended by this article, and his response spawned a heated email exchange between him and Ezra Klein, which eventually culminated in this debate. Sam Harris sees himself as a big advocate for science and scientific progress. Harris sees science as an absolute good for humanity, and he wants to facilitate and support science as much as possible with the aim of creating a better future for all people. Harris identifies the political left as being a threat to the productive and free progress of scientific ideas. For Harris, the political left is overly concerned with issues of racial sensitivity and political correctness and identity politics in a way that causes harm to honest intellectuals and threatens to inhibit the healthy progression of science in our society. Sam Harris.
But the problem is that the data on population differences will continue to emerge whether we're looking for it or not. And the idea that one should lie about these data or pretend to be convinced by bad arguments that are politically correct, or worse, that it's okay to malign people or even destroy their reputations if they won't pretend to be convinced by bad arguments, that's a disaster. Okay, that is morally and politically and intellectually, that is a disaster. And that's where we are.
Harris wants us to live in a society that is robust to uncomfortable scientific ideas. He wants to live in a society where scientists can learn that some races are smarter and more capable than others without us having to worry that those scientific conclusions will bring about social unrest or racism or violence.
The end game here is to not care about differences among groups, to treat individuals as individuals, and to realize that yes, people have different sets of gifts and competences, and we can change them. We can give people whatever advantages we can, and we should. And we're moving into a future where we'll be able to change these things about ourselves in very intrusive ways. We'll be able to change our genes. We'll be able to change the genes of our kids. We'll be able to put technology directly into our brains. And not everyone will have access to this technology at the same time. And this will open a door to another aspect of inequality that could be hugely consequential. This is all stuff that we have to get ready for.
This is a point that Harris repeated over and over again throughout the conversation. And it's clear that Harris felt that Klein didn't really respond to this point. I think a source of confusion in this debate is that Harris failed to see the ways in which Ezra Klein actually agrees with him. I think it's pretty clear that Ezra Klein agrees with Harris about the value of science, and Klein also wants to live in a world that is robust to uncomfortable scientific discoveries. Klein said multiple times that he agrees with Harris that there are all sorts of excesses on the left, and that it's a bad thing that Murray was deplatformed at Middlebury. Ultimately, Klein's argument is that we should try to move in the direction of Harris's science utopia, a world where scientists can make uncomfortable discoveries and society continues to function in a fair and ethical way. But that doesn't mean that Murray's work can't be challenged. The Vox piece, Charles Murray is once again peddling junk science about race and IQ, carefully unpacks Murray's ideas about race and IQ. It goes in great detail to show that there are serious shortcomings to Charles Murray's analysis. Klein came into this debate with Harris making a very similar argument, that Charles Murray is not a scientist, that his methods are not compelling, and his conclusions are not accepted by the wider scientific community. Ezra Klein.
You're a neuroscientist, and so I get that you look at Murray and you look at the bell curve, and what you see are the tables and the appendices and the kind of scientific version of Charles Murray. I'm a policy journalist. My background is I live in Washington, D.C. I cover politics. Charles Murray, not just to me, what he literally is what we call a policy entrepreneur. He's somebody who his entire career has been spent at Washington think tanks. He's at the American Enterprise Institute, where I have a lot of friends, and I respect that organization quite a bit. And he argues in different ways and throughout his entire body of work for policy outcomes. He literally says, and again, I can quote this to you if you'd like, he says, for one thing, we have all these low cognitive capacity women giving birth. And by having these social supports for poor children in this country, we are subsidizing them to give birth. And what we need to do is take those subsidies away.
In response, Harris brought examples of other scientists who have corroborated some of Murray's race realism conclusions. I'm not in a position to judge whether or not the sources and corroborations that Harris cited are sufficient to show that Murray's work and conclusions are legitimate science. It seems to me that Murray's work is not serious science and should be taken within the context of Murray's very specific political motivations. But whether or not I'm right about that, whether or not Klein is right about this issue, the deeper question here is, how should a person like Murray be interviewed on a podcast? How should his ideas be approached? What are the right questions to ask? What are the right questions for Harris to ask? What are the right questions for us to ask? Is it reasonable for us to be skeptical about a work that on its face seems to be very scientific? These are the important questions, and these are the questions that Klein tried to engage Harris with throughout this debate. After Klein got his criticism of Murray out of the way, the debate moved on to two other important questions that I want to summarize here. The first question is how an understanding of historical context should or should not affect our thinking about Murray's race science. And the second question is the question of identity politics. What does it mean to play identity politics? Who is and who isn't guilty of identity politics? For Ezra Klein, white America has a long history of peddling junk science about race to justify and promote racial injustice. For Klein, this context and this legacy of race science is critical for assessing the work of someone like Charles Murray.
Every point in American history we have made that argument, we now look back. And I mean, this is not going way back, right? Segregation, my mom was alive in segregation. Charles Murray was alive during segregation. We're talking, I think it's within the week of the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. I mean, this is not ancient history, it is recent history. And I think we look back and we say, man, they really had it wrong. And you quoted back at me something that I think it's either I say it or the Vox authors say it, now I don't remember. But that, yeah, if you're having a version of this conversation again, it is incumbent on you to say why you're so sure it will be different this time. And Murray does say, he thinks that some combination of genetic and basically immutably environmental characteristics make it so we can't do much about this, and there just are big differences between the groups, and it's just going to remain that way. And American politics needs to rearrange itself around that reality. And yeah, I strongly disagree, and I disagree because of American history. And that is why my fundamental criticism of that conversation was that you needed to deal with more. You needed to deal more with the history of this conversation and the history of this country.
But
Harris, on the other hand, sees science as happening in this idyllic liminal space. For him, questions of ulterior political motives and historical context are basically irrelevant when it comes to assessing science.
There's nothing I've said here that discounts the history of racism and pseudoscience and the fact that it's quite possible to be a racist scientist. That is true in every generation. But scientific data can't be racist.
So, an intuition of skepticism grounded in the abject failure of race science in the past is one way that historical context is important when approaching Charles Murray's work. But in addition to that, historical context is uniquely relevant to the study of race and IQ because even Charles Murray agrees that IQ test results are heavily influenced by environmental factors. The Flynn effect, which comes up in this debate, notes that the average IQ in the developed world has gone up 3 points every decade since the 1930s. The Flynn effect proves that IQ measures are heavily influenced by environmental factors that we don't fully understand. If we look at the unique experience of African Americans in America, and we observe that the environment of the average white person in America is very different than the average black person in America, it's no longer obvious that this IQ gap is permanent. For context, Jim Crow segregation wasn't abolished until 1964. Charles Murray literally came into adulthood in a Jim Crow segregated America. This is the critical context that Sam Harris astonishingly ignores.
But my criticism of your podcast, and by the way, my criticism also of Murray, and this is useful because I can work backwards through your answer here, is not that you didn't excuse yourself. It's that in a conversation about an outcome of American life, right? How do African Americans and whites score on IQ tests in America today? What happens when somebody sits down and takes a test today? That is an outcome of the American experiment, an experiment we've been running in this country for hundreds of years. You did not discuss actually how race and racism act upon that outcome. You did not discuss, amazingly to me, you all didn't talk about slavery or segregation once. And what I'm saying here is not that you lack empathy, although I am saying in a different space, I think you have a sense of what Murray's going through that is different from your sense of what other people who are hurt in this conversation go through. I do believe that. But as it comes to the way you actually conducted the conversation, I'm arguing that you lacked a sense of history.
The last critical point of this debate was the question of identity politics and tribalism. Harris defined what he means by identity politics as follows.
What I mean by identity politics is that you are reasoning on the basis of skin color or religion or gender or some particular trait which you have by accident, which you can't change. Which is just you fell into that bin through no process of reasoning on your own. You couldn't be convinced to be white or black, and to reason from that place as though because you're you, because you have the skin color you have, certain things are true and very likely incommunicable to other people who don't share your identity. And this, I view this as the most unhappy game of Dungeons and Dragons ever. It's just people have these various stories of victimology that each, if you do the arithmetic one way, one group trumps another way it gets reversed. And this strikes me as a moral and political and intellectual dead end.
It's obvious to anyone who has read or listened to Sam Harris that Sam Harris prides himself in his rationality. Harris is very proud of the fact that other people think tribally and are affected by all sorts of cognitive biases and identity politics, but he, Sam Harris, is not. One of Klein's main points throughout this debate is that Harris is biased in his approach to these issues. Harris's commitment to rationality and logic and objectivity notwithstanding, he is far more sensitive to perceived threats to his own tribe and his own identity, namely the identity of being a white public intellectual like Charles Murray, and he is far less sensitive and less aware of threats to other people's tribe. This selective sensitivity, this in-group preference, is an example of exactly the same kind of identity politics that Harris is so quick to deride in others.
Look, we all have a lot of different identities we're part of at all times. You know, I do too, right? I have all kinds of identities that you can call forward. All of them can bias me simultaneously. And the questions, of course, are which dominate and how am I able to counterbalance them through my process of information gathering and adjudication of that information. But I think that your core identity in this is as someone who feels you get treated unfairly by politically correct mobs. And
But that's you're playing. That is not identity politics. That is my experience as a public intellectual trying to talk about ideas.
That I will say this. That is what folks from the dominant group get to do. They get to say, my thing isn't identity politics, only yours is. I will tell you, Sam, when people who do not look like you hear you telling them that this is just identity politics, they don't think, God, he's right. That is just identity politics. They think this is my experience and you don't understand it. You just said it's your experience and they don't understand it.
You think that's Glenn Lowry's view of it, or Ayaan Hirsi Ali's view of it, or Majid Nawaz's view of it?
I think that you have said publicly that you will not have a conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates because you think he just plays identity politics.
Yeah.
For me, this is such a critical point. Harris has managed to convince himself that he is so pristinely rational and to effectively ignore and denigrate the concerns of minorities that he doesn't empathize with and doesn't relate to.
In your whole show, Sam, you've had 120 some episodes. And I could have miscounted this. I totally take that.
It's amazing you would think this is relevant, but
yes,
give me the numbers.
I think you've had 2 African Americans as guests. I think you need to explore the experience of race in America more and not just see that as identity politics. See that as information that is important to talking about some of the things you want to talk about, but also to hearing from some of the people who you've now written out of the conversation.
For me, it seems this debate is the most fundamental of this current political moment. Harris is not a Trump supporter. However, this question of whether or not there are minorities and disenfranchised communities with unique problems and unique concerns that are worth listening to and are worth learning about seems to me to be the fundamental and critical question of this Trump era. Trump seems to me to be the candidate of the anti-racists. Trump seems to have been fueled by the sense that anything the left despises is necessarily correct.
Here is my view. I think you clearly have a deep empathy for Charles Murray's side of this conversation because you see yourself in it. I don't think you have as deep an empathy for the other side of this conversation, for the people being told, once again, that they are genetically and environmentally and at any rate immutably less intelligent, and that our social policy should reflect that. And I think part of the absence of that empathy is it doesn't threaten you. I don't think you see a threat to you in that in the way you see a threat to you in what's happened to Murray. In some cases, I'm not even quite sure you heard what Murray was saying on social policy, either in the bell curve, in a lot of his later work, or on the podcast. And I think that led to a blind spot in this it's worth discussing.
Mm-hmm.
I like your podcast. I think you have a big platform and a big audience, and I think it's bad for the world if Murray's take on this gets recast here as political bravery or impartial or non-controversial. So what I want to do here, it's not really convince you that I'm right. I don't think I'm going to do that. And it's not to convince you to like me. I don't think I'm going to do that either. I get that. What I want to convince you of is that there's a side of this you should become more curious about. You should be doing shows with people like Ibram Kendi, who's author of Stamped from the Beginning, which is a book on racist ideas in America, which won the National Book Award a couple years back. People who really study how race and these ideas interact with American life and policy.
When I was in high school, I was very impressed with this new atheist movement that Harris is a part of. I've read a lot from Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens. I used to be convinced that I could use the power of my intellect to become a very moral person. But more recently, I've begun to see that view as being inadequate and even a little dangerous. Harris's super-rational approach to moral and political problems is fine in principle, and it could lead to many correct ideas. But I think that if it's not guided by an honest attempt to learn about the experiences of other human beings, it can lead to serious blind spots in our thinking.